Coming up next, Paul Stamets, all things mushrooms. They're not just for eating anymore, and they never were. This is Coast to Coast AM. This is going to be fun. His book is Mycelium, or is it Mycelium? I'll find out. Mycelium Running, How Mushrooms Can Help Save the World. I know what you're thinking, but I think you might be just right there, about to get hit by something you don't expect. His website is fungi, fungi.com. I'm going to get to the bottom of a bunch of stuff. I want to find out what the difference between a mushroom and a toadstool is, but I digress momentarily. He's been a dedicated mycologist for over 30 years. Over this time, he has discovered and co-authored 4 new species of mushrooms and pioneered countless techniques in the field of edible and medicinal mushroom cultivation. He received the 1998 Bioneers Award from the Collective Heritage Institute and the 1999 founder of a new Northwest Award from the Pacific Rim Association of Resource Conservation and Development Councils. Say that 10 times. In 2008, Paul received the National Geographic Adventure Magazine's Green Novator and the Argosy Foundation's E-Achievement Awards. Also named one of UTNE Reader's 50 Visionaries Who Are Changing the World in their November-December 2008 issue. In February 2010, he received the President's Award from the Society for Ecological Restoration, Northwest Chapter, in recognition of his contributions to ecological restoration. He has written 6 books on mushroom cultivation, use, and identification. His books, Growing Gourmet and Medicinal Mushrooms and The Mushroom Cultivator, he's co-author of that one, have been long hailed as the definitive texts of mushroom cultivation. Tonight, we're going to talk about Paul's mission to save the world with mushrooms. I'm not kidding you. This is Coast to Coast AM. Paul Stamets, he is a first-time guest on Coast to Coast AM. Please welcome him upon the bridge of the mothership. Paul, how are you tonight? And thanks a lot for joining us.
Very well, John. Honored to be here.
Well, tell us all about you. Tell us what you do. You've got a lot of awards, and people are going, mushrooms? What? And after viewing some of your stuff on YouTube and going through your books, this is a lot to digest in 4 days, let me tell you, my friend. But it's phenomenal. We're talking the original internet, among other things, and all these miraculous recoveries, even your mom, as a result of a mushroom regimen. So tell us what led you to this work, and tell us how deep this the rabbit hole under the mushroom goes.
Yeah, it's quite unexpected to most people. The knowledge of mushrooms has been very limited because mushrooms are very ephemeral. They're only on your visual viewscape for a few days, whereas plants and animals, we see them for months, years. But mushrooms come up and then they disappear in a few days, and people have a very short time or window of experience to be able to study them. So it's not surprising that mushrooms, some of them can kill you, some of them can feed you, some of them can heal you, some of them can get you high. It's not surprising that which is so powerful would elicit fear from people because they're so poorly understood. And that which is poorly understood and could be dangerous is usually avoided. So there's a term that R. Gordon Wasson coined called mycophobia, the fear of mushrooms. And mycophobia really stems a lot from our English background, those of us who have heritage from Britain, and that's where the term toadstool came from. Whereas mycophilia, many societies in Asia and Eastern Europe are very mycophilic. They have a long history and affection for mushrooms. And they're called toadstools, by the way, John, because mushrooms sit upon, or frogs and toads can sit upon mushrooms. And as the mushrooms sporulate, they attract insects. And so it's very convenient for the frogs to zap the insects out of the air. They don't have to go racing after them. They can just sit there. And so these mushrooms are great beacons that attract many, many insects. But my journey to the field of mycology, which is the study of fungi, has been long and rather inadvertent. My family warned me and admonished me not to throw puffballs at my twin brother when I was 5 years old. and we loved throwing puffballs at each other because they would explode upon impact. And
Right.
my mother warned me that the spores of puffballs could make my twin brother blind. Not true, but I put that information readily to use and pelted my twin brothers with as many puffballs as I could. Now we both suffer from nearsightedness, but that's not because of the puffball spores. That's my earliest memory of dealing with mushrooms and growing up in Ohio. And after the summer rains, these puffballs would pop up. And so I was fascinated by their sudden occurrence and their sudden disappearance. But that was my first memory of dealing with these interesting organisms. And my life has been dedicated to studying them since then.
Let's go all the way back to, let's take it back to when the big asteroid came down. And I don't know, do you subscribe to the theory that that's what wiped out the dinosaurs, with the big asteroid hit the Earth and caused darkness, and that was the end of them? And then the mushrooms came, apparently.
Well, there's been several major extinction events in the course of life on this planet. The first one that we know about from an asteroid impact was the 250 million years ago at the Permian-Triassic boundary. And that there's three competing theories. It was either an asteroid impact, or it was methane hydrate bursts coming out of the ocean, or there are volcanoes that were bursting out of Eurasia. I don't see these as being mutually exclusive. An asteroid impact could have triggered the earthquakes that caused the methane hydrate burst to occur. In any event, the Earth was shrouded in dust, and light was cut off, and there was a massive extinction. More than 90% of the species in the fossil record we know then became extinct. And because fungi don't require light, fungi inherited the Earth. Those organisms that paired with fungi had a better chance of survival. And so as we move forward to 65, 66 million years ago, now we know there was another asteroid impact. It's very interesting because asteroids are in the news these days. And then the same thing occurred. Enormous amounts of debris jettisoned into the atmosphere. Sunlight was cut off. And then fungi re-inherited the Earth. Now, there's a recurring theme here. Those organisms that pair with fungi have a better chance of survival. And so these fungi are extremely diverse. There's more than 5 million species of fungi on this planet, of which there are a total of 10 million species of all organisms. Now, the problem that we face now is we've entered into 6X, the sixth most dramatic extinction event known in the history of life on this planet. But this extinction event is unusual. It's not caused by an asteroid impact. It is caused by a species. It's caused by us. And we are not only the cause of this extinction event, but we're likely to be its victim. And this is something that we should be very, very concerned about, because we live in this very short lifespan, and we look around and we don't see these megatrends that are occurring. Typically, about 10 species become extinct per year based on the fossil record. Now we're losing between 20 to 30,000 species per year. And like rivets on an airplane, as we lose these species, at what point will we have catastrophic failure? And so we're extremely concerned now that we are in the midst of a giant event that's going to see the loss of species heretofore unprecedented. And people are very concerned about global warming and climate change, and they should be. But far more devastating currently is pollution. And the chemical toxins that are being emitted into the environment is harming the very life cycles that give us support. Most people don't realize that up to 25% of the world biomass on land is made of fungi. And up to 40% of the humus in the forest are actually fungal filaments. And the mycelium, which is this cobwebby-like substance that grows virtually everywhere, and anyone who's tipped over a log or a piece of wood has seen it. It's a cobwebby white substance, and it's so dense, but it's so fine that in a single cubic inch there can be more than 8 miles of these cells. So they're very, very delicate, fine filaments, but these fungi are the grand molecular disassemblers of nature. They create soil. And the thin soil that we depend upon is not only thinning because of erosion and loss of habitat, but because of the chemical insults that are being inflicted upon the environment are devastating to species diversity. So at what point where our biodiversity levels plummet that suddenly nature will unravel, and then our food systems are going to collapse? And this is something that people should be very concerned about. Biodiversity is what got us here today. And it's estimated it'll take about 10 million years after one of these great extinction events before species biodiversity actually recovers. So this is something that people should be aware of. The good news is that these fungi can come to the rescue, and based on past events of these great extinctions, we know that those organisms that pair with fungi tend to survive. And hey, folks, it's probably a good lesson that we should listen to. And by pairing with fungi, I think we have many solutions to some of the problems that we face today.
You know, you were talking about all these various species that are being lost. You're talking about the full spectrum of species. Are you talking about birds, fish, just general fauna?
Yeah, it is across the landscape. When we look at how soil has been created, now the best examples at the end of the Pleistocene, 11,800 years ago, about 12,000 years ago, was the end of the Ice Age. And most of us have been around glaciers that have been melting, and there are moraine fields, basically gravel beds. And as the ice melts, this topsoil is flushed into the streams and is carried away. And these gravel beds have little lenses of soil, and some plants will then come up the next year, and they'll grow, and then they'll climax, and they'll die, and then the fungi will decompose them, and the soil lens becomes a little bit larger, and that happens repeatedly over hundreds, thousands of years. So in 12,000 years here in the Pacific Northwest and across much of the world, the soil is literally only a foot or 2 feet deep. And so we're dependent upon this incredibly thin soil layer for life and for all of our food systems and all of that biodiversity. Soil is just not dirt. It's a living, it's very complex living communities. And I'm speaking to you, John, but I'm a giant microbial community. I am Paul Stamets, but there's 100 trillion cells, most of which are non-human cells, and I have 10 trillion human cells to 100 trillion non-human cells.
Really?
And so I'm a giant microbial community speaking to your microbial communities, and this is the way of nature. We live in constant equilibrium, having these massive communities that are constantly in molecular dialogue with each other, and from this complexity, we have sustainability. And without that complexity, the whole system begins to unravel.
Tell us a little bit more about the nature of mushrooms. As I was looking at one of your videos, it appears that not only mushrooms know when you're around them. Did I get that correctly? And they communicate with each other, and they make this big network?
These networks are not to be underestimated, and there is a new buzzword in science called epigenesis. Now, epigenesis is the influence of an environmental stimulus on the genome, so you have a response to an environmental stimulus genetically. So genes then will code for new responses, new proteins, new ways of surviving based on environmental stimuli. And these fungi are network-based organisms. And so looking at the mycelium under the electron microscope or under a microscope, you can see that they're highly branched, but in a meter diameter mycelial mat on the ground, they can literally be trillions and trillions of end branchings. And at these tips, they become multinucleate. And at the very tips, they're constantly forking, and they're foraging for food. Now, if there's a new insect, there's a new chemical toxin, there's a new potential food source. If there's a reassortment of nuclei and there is a new genetic expression that leads to a solution to capturing that new ingredient as a food source, because of epigenesis, What happens? The mycelium surges and gobbles that up. But then that information back channels to the mycelial network. So these are self-learning membranes. Think of them as trillions of scientists constantly doing experiments, constantly adapting. And so what's amazing about these mycelial networks is that they are so adaptive. They're self-learning. Now, we diverged from fungi 650 million years ago. And in fact, there's a new super kingdom that was erected. 35 scientists co-authored a paper in the Journal of Eukaryotic Microbiology, and the new super kingdom is called a Paislacanta. It joins Animalia and fungi together because we have a more common ancestry with fungi than we do with any other kingdom. We exhale carbon dioxide, we inhale oxygen. And so these mycelial networks, we went the route of enclosing our nutrients in a cellular sac and creating basically a stomach. The fungi went the route of externally digesting its nutrients and then bringing in the food that it needs directly through the cell walls. So these are externalized lungs. They exhale carbon dioxide, inhale oxygen. They're externalized stomachs. They are digesting nutrients outside of their cells. And I believe these are externalized neurological networks. And I believe the invention of the computer internet is an inevitable consequence of a previously proven evolutionary successful model. Nature builds upon its prior successes. And I personally believe the Earth invented the computer internet at a time critical when resource management and sharing and awareness of this catastrophe we're in the midst of can be rectified, because the organisms of this planet have a self-interest in our knowing how to best be the stewards so they can survive. So we're all in this Earth ship together. And I believe we'll find network-based organisms on other planets. I think this is the way of nature, and it makes very good sense scientifically because of epigenesis and the ability of these membranes to constantly adapt.
Well, yes, it does make sense, and it lends a fairly profound insight into our own being. We seem to, well, you just said it, Paul. They developed their own internet when resource management was of utmost importance, and it appears that the human being has followed suit.
Yeah, I think that nature is inherently intelligent, and I was thinking about this earlier today. Is that when you define, or the old definitions of intelligence, it used to be, well, animals aren't intelligent unless they use tools. Well, we know that, crows use tools to get, bugs, and all sorts of other animals use tools. So that definition changed. But it's so much of a self-indicting argument. And I had a great argument with my older brother, Bill, who is very much intellectual. And he says, how can you dare say that nature is intelligent? And I said, do you know how ridiculous that sounds, coming using the voice from the brain that nature evolved to give you, that you doubt that nature is intelligent when you're part of nature in the first place? And so, but these are kind of circular reasoning arguments. There's a lot, that we are discovering, heretofore unknown in the field of science. What we do know now is complexity and biodiversity, and community and symbiosis and mutualism is the way of nature. We are no longer single organisms. We're walking on these mosaics of mycelial mats. Literally, as we take every footstep on the ground, we're covering several hundred miles of mycelium. And when we break twigs and debris and create catastrophes, and these fungi respond to catastrophia, and we're the greatest walking catastrophe on the planet that I know, and these fungi surge in the aftermath of our destructive activities, footsteps, construction, whatever, and they surge and they go after these debris trails, trying to gobble them up because they're in competition with 5 million other species of fungi.
Good grief. Unbelievable. Can you hold your thought right there while we take our hard network a break?
Sure.
Paul Stamets is our first-time guest. Now, Paul, I'm counting on you to pick up right where you left off. We'll be right back on Coast to Coast AM. Paul Stamets is with us tonight. His website, you will find it very interesting. It is fungi.com, fungi.com. And we're talking about how mushrooms can help save the world. Apparently, they're far more important than we ever thought. I'm happy to know what a toadstool actually is. I didn't know they actually sat on them. I thought it was just for pixies and fairies and the like, but it's not true. Most of these things are rooted in fact anyway, if you just look deep enough. And every once in a while you'll come across somebody like Paul Stamets who can put you wise to it. In the meantime, I wonder how many fatalities there were in finding which mushrooms we can eat, which ones will serve us medicinally, and which ones actually nurture life on this planet. You walk through the woods, you walk through the forest, you see them every once in a while, and you say, "Oh, look at those! Wow, that's kind of gross looking. Ooh, look at the size of that one. It's freaky. It's almost disgusting." But that appearance is a disguise for something that is absolutely vital to the planet, and that is why talking about mushrooms tonight with Paul Stamets is so important, and it is. And we'll be right back with him after this little short break as we carry on through Saturday night on Coast to Coast AM. Paul, if you want to pick up right where we left off, it's perfectly all right with me. And if you don't, we'll move on to something else because I got a zillion questions for you.
Well, there's a lot to cover. I think that one of the take-home messages here is that fungi are edge runners. They love interface environments, and they're agents of change, and they react to change, and they adapt to it. And they set the stage for the proliferation of biodiversity downstream. So oftentimes, if there's toxins or if the food webs are not well established to feed other organisms, the fungi come in, and they're molecular decomposers. They disassemble large organic complexes and render them into a form that's useful to many other organisms. So as a result, they set up communities, and so the lattice work of these fine filaments, this cobwebby mycelium, species will select beneficial bacteria that'll grow with them, and the beneficial bacteria then can also help the plants that then surge from that soil base and then create the debris fields that feed the mycelium that the mycelium selected for that ecosystem in order to benefit the associated communities of organisms. So these established habitats, and fungi were the first organisms that came onto land more than 1 billion years ago. Plants followed several 100 million years later. What most people don't realize is fungi eat rocks. They mineralize rocks, and the mycelium exudes these metabolic droplets, these enzymes and acids, one of which is called oxalic acid. And oxalic acid pulls iron and calcium and other minerals out of the rocks. And when it does so, it pockmarks the rock and it makes it more crumbling. And this is the first step in the generation of soil. And so fungi came to land first, and plants followed. And then as these finger-like mycelial tips, mineralized rocks, they give those minerals to plants. Now, fungi and algae came together to form lichens, and most people don't know about lichens, but lichens are actually a mutualistic community of fungi and plants, each of which can grow independently, but when they form this association, they're very, very good at digesting rocks. And so, these fungi create the very landscapes upon which we are dependent. And it's an excellent example of the importance of fungi is in some of these extreme environments. And there is a wonderful group of scientists who made a discovery about 10 years ago. And many people listening probably have been to Yellowstone Hot Springs. And when you walk around the boardwalk around Old Faithful, these steaming hot pools. And scientists noticed that there are grasses growing in the hot water. And they thought, this is amazing. These grasses are very thermotolerant. The water is 140 degrees, and yet these grasses are flourishing. So when they took samples of the grass and they took them into a laboratory and they cultured them, they got a mold. And they thought it was a contaminant, so they threw it away. and then they grew the grasses, and the grasses then all died at 110 degrees. And so one scientist realized, that mold that you thought was a contaminant, it may have been a beneficial fungus. And so they went back, and when they joined that fungus back with the grasses, they found something astonishing. It gave the grasses thermotolerance. So the grasses were able to grow up to 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, these are called endophytic fungi. Endo means growing upon, and phytic means plants. So these are fungi that grow inside of the plants, parallel to the cells. And so scientists for years always thought that these fungi were an example of a pathogen, and only recently have we come to realize that these are beneficial fungi. Now, we fast forward a few years, and another group of scientists, when this was published, went, this is really important because rice is a grass, corn is a grass, and so with global climate change and with the increase in desertification, finding thermotolerance for food crops is obviously very, very important. And so they went and they got a culture of this fungus from the American Type Culture Collection. Now, that's the largest repository of fungi and bacteria and lots of other cell lines in the world. And they keep their cultures under liquid nitrogen, super, super cold. And so when they retrieve the culture of this fungus and they join it with tomato plants, they fully expected that the tomato plants would benefit in having thermotolerance, just like the grasses showed from Yellowstone. But they grew these tomato plants up, and they all died at around 110 degrees again. And they were confounded. And so they wrote the original researchers saying, what happened? This fungus was supposed to give thermotolerance, and it did not. Well, fortunately, the original scientists still had those cultures of the fungus, which they never put under liquid nitrogen. And then something was discovered heretofore unprecedented in the field of science. When they examined the difference between the same culture that was put under liquid nitrogen versus the culture that was sitting on the shelf, they found that the culture sitting on the shelf had within it a virus. And for the first time, we realized that there was a mutualism, a symbiosis between a plant and a fungus that harbored a virus. And counterintuitively, when the culture was put under liquid nitrogen, the virus was killed. And so for the first time, we understand now that this community of a fungus holding a virus with a plant conferred thermotolerance. How many other examples are there out there? And how many people know about beneficial viruses? I give quite a few talks to doctors, and I like asking, how many of you know of beneficial viruses? Now, we know viruses now as being vectors for transferring genes, for fighting cancer, et cetera. But, there's very little knowledge about the role of beneficial viruses, because when you're sick, you look for the causal organism that caused the illness. But when you're healthy, do you look for a beneficial virus that's conferring that benefit? And this segues into what I think, hypothetically, is my good friend Andy Weil is from Tucson, Arizona. It's very hot down there. And he comes up here, and it's in the Northwest, and it's 55, 60 degrees. I'm in a T-shirt, and he's cold, and I'm not. And I wonder, by eating food bioregionally, specific to the environment in which you are living, are you benefiting from the complex biology of the food system that's adapted to that climate? And when you go outside of that climate to another climate, your biota has to change in order to be able to adapt. And this, I think, is a good argument for buying food growing locally. So there's many, many implications here, which I think are extraordinarily important. And we're just seeing the tip of the proverbial iceberg in terms of the knowledge that we know is literally underneath our feet. And unfortunately, the field of mycology is underfunded. There's 50,000 mycologists at best in the world. Maybe 5,000 are employed, and I think the field of mycology should be funded equal to that of the computer sciences. I think it's incredibly important that we engage these fungi and their inherent knowledge to help make this planet a better place and to make it much better for our children and our descendants, because we are now full on board, slipping down a slippery slope to a very frightening future that I don't think that we can grow our food in a test tube and be able to invent ourselves out of this without engaging the complexity of nature.
Let me just revisit a couple of things that you mentioned. Do you feel that you mentioned beneficial virus? Do you think viruses? Do you embrace the proposition that viruses are actually responsible for human evolution? Have you given it much thought?
Yes, I do think. Viruses are not organisms. They're not really life forms, but they hijack and utilize our DNA and the DNA of other organisms and allows their replication. So there's increasingly much evidence that viruses are drivers of evolution and may likely have been the precursors to life.
Do we actually know their origin? They seem to spontaneously burst into existence and then go away after they've done their thing, whatever it might be, whether it's detrimental or whether it's, some nurturing or, remedial effect that it has on an ailing organism like a person.
John, that's a great question, and something that I think about a lot. My personal belief system, now I grew up in a charismatic Christian environment, and I mean no offense to anybody. This is just my own personal view. My personal view is that matter begets life. Life becomes single cells. Single cells become strings of cells. Strings then fork, network, form a fabric, and this is the way of life throughout the universe.
The planets behave that way even.
Pardon?
The celestial bodies even behave that way.
I think that we are going to find life forms throughout the planet, and viral particles are likely one vector through which these proto-life forms are streamed across the planet. We just had an asteroid come very close to the Earth. We had a meteorite explode over Russia. A lot of scientists are probably wondering, I wonder what was inside of those meteorites, these are a way of transmitting life forms. Now, I don't believe that fungi came from outer space, but I do believe the Earth is spewing out fungal DNA into space. So clearly, panspermia is occurring, and spores are rich in the atmosphere. There's a wonderful experiment by a high school student, and she did this experiment I believe, on the shores of Georgia, and she walked out into the tide flats, and she put up a mylar sheet, a sail, and she coated it, I think, with mineral oil, and she exposed it to the prevailing winds, that were coming across the Atlantic. And then after a few hours, she closed up that mylar sheet, and she took it back to the laboratory, and she amplified the DNA, and she got fungal spores from Africa. It's an amazingly cool experiment. And this, of course, there are fungal spores in the higher atmosphere, and we are these spores are being pumped out into space. And I think that it's very likely it will find fungal life forms elsewhere in the cosmos. And
you can think. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Keep going.
No, I think so. Mars is the most likely candidate, and I think it won't be too far in the future that we'll find very, very definitive evidence of life being on Mars.
So I was just wondering, I wonder if these asteroids are delivering stuff. Or maybe they're not. Maybe they're picking up stuff from us and delivering it somewhere else.
These near misses, no doubt, would be picking up some of these spores and carrying them heretofore. So, yes, this is all happening. And we suffer from myopia of our own belief that we're the most intelligent organism in the universe, and we used to think the Earth was the center of the universe, and then there were the flat earthers. So the evolution of science has gone through leaps and bounds, and I think a lot of scientists now are a lot more chagrined in not in not lowering their expectations, because I think now it's a very exciting time for science, because there's so many discoveries that are showing how elaborate and wonderful nature really is.
Let's go back to something else that you mentioned, which was that it's probably beneficial to eat the produce from where you live. Is there a flip side to that coin? Like it might be detrimental to eat things that come from elsewhere?
I would think so. Bioregionalism of our food is something that's really important. I don't want to stray too far afield here, but it blows me away that people voted down GMO labeling, and country of origin labeling. Why wouldn't you want to know where your food is coming from? Why wouldn't you want to know whether these foods were GMOs or not? And so I think it's really important that we encourage organic agriculture, that we eat foods locally, and that we can't sustain a system where we're getting water from Fiji, where we're getting shrimp from Hong Kong. If you knew the shrimp that you're eating in a salad came from Hong Kong or Alaska, which would you choose? I think we have a right to know. Now, the country of origin labeling with fish has passed, and we do have that. But why don't we have it for all of our other foods? I think this is really, really important. But
there's got to be some serious political pressure keeping this GMO labeling from happening.
I think there's a lot of industries who have vested interests in the public not being knowledgeable about what is happening, and I think that. Have you studied these foods very much, Paul? I mean, the GMO aspect. I have a fairly decent knowledge of the GMO aspects because.
Let me ask you this: Is it true that GMO wheat was actually introduced into the American diet, certainly, in the 70s, and that it produced this additional protein, which is why eating bread makes people overweight, like almost instantly?
I do not know that to be a fact, and you're probably more of an expert at this than me. But
I'm just a hacker.
My family comes. We have wheat land in eastern Washington, in the Palouse country. My great-great-grandfather bought 10,000 acres of wheat and had 10 kids, and each kid got 1,000 acres. By the way, it's a great story because it was 7 boys and 3 girls. The 7 boys got their land in 1927. They all gambled and leveraged it to buy stock in the stock market. The 3 girls, one of which was my grandmother, refused to do so. The 7 boys lost 7,000 acres, and the 3 daughters kept their land, and I'm happy to inherit some of the wheat land now because
Excellent.
My family, my grandmother did not gamble on her inheritance. But I mentioned that because we were over in eastern Washington, the Palouse country, and now because of Roundup Ready seeds, now there are super weeds that are evolving. And Washington State University came out with a study and excellent photographs showing how now these weeds have developed tolerances, and some of these wheat fields, these noxious weeds have taken over, and they have now become resistant. Nature always finds a way. Nature bats last. And the problem with the GMO industry, I think, is profit is their biggest incentive. And despite the assurances that they have given us that there would be no genetic drift, there'd be no crossovers, we're seeing that there are. And I think the profit motive, unfortunately, the precautionary principle is not being put into effect here. And so because of greed and profit, and some of these people are extremely well motivated. They want to feed the world. They want to be able to make the world a better place. But I think we in the theater of evolution over billions of years, nature has been able to select and deselect, these successes that build these communities.
Gotcha. Let's finish up real quick. You're down to seconds.
Okay, now we're involved in monoculture. As we get into monoculture, we're getting away from biodiversity. So I think it's important we go back to biodiversity.
Let's talk about what?
Monoculture.
Monoculture and biodiversity. Let's pick that up when we come back. We'll do a little news and all that stuff. Paul, thanks for being here tonight. First-time guest, Paul Stamets, fungi.com, fungi.com. Check it out. This is Coast. I will make this announcement again that this is our first-time guest, Paul Stamets, author of many, many books. Mycomedicinal psilocybin mushrooms of the world, growing gourmet and medicinal mushrooms, and the mushroom cultivator, as well as mycelium running, how mushrooms can help save the world. We're going to get into some stuff about mycoremediation. I'm wondering how much remediation is possible. I think I heard a rumor about a diesel spill where mushrooms were instrumental. I want to know how long people have been carrying these things around. And I believe that I heard that one of them will even hold heat or fire for a rather long period of time. They're remarkable, and if I understand what Paul Stamets was saying, the reason we have soil is because the universe has got nothing but time, and if it takes that long for the mushrooms to break down the rocks and create soil, well, I guess if it takes a few 100,000 years, so what? Plenty more where that came from in an infinite universe. We'll be back with Paul in just a moment on Coast to Coast AM. Okay, Paul, let's recapitulate here for just a moment. Explain to, I don't mean to seem like a dunderhead here, but just explain what the monoculture, what does that really mean to we individual earthlings, and why should we beware of it?
Well, a classic example, even though I am academically trained, I believe in the school of hard knocks, and I was a blue-collar worker working in the sawmills and the shingle mills. And then, when I was around 21 years of age, I went into the woods, as a logger and set chokers and did that for 2 years until 3 guys in my crew got killed, and then I decided to go back to college. But
Gotcha.
Clear cutting, in the view of forestry has been to treat forests as if they're cornfields, and that's a monocrop. You would cut them all down and replant them all in 1 year, and you wouldn't have this multi-stage canopy growth that you would see in the native forests. And so as a result of clear cutting, and going back to the soil that I was talking about that was built up in the past 10,000 years, and so I'm setting chokers in the woods, and the root wads are only 3 feet deep, and they're 20 to 40 feet across, and these trees are 200 feet tall. It's just amazing. The roots were so shallow. And then we cut down the trees, and I'm sitting in the brush a lot, and I'm thinking, well, I can see where all the carbon's going. We were doing 3 log loads. These are 3 trees to a logging truck, and these are massive trees. And so I was actively involved in killing the old-growth forest. And then the trees will be cut. So let's go back into about 1900 when the old-growth trees were everywhere. And so you cut down the trees, and they would be taken away, and then they would burn. So there's 2 withdrawals from the carbon bank. Now, the carbon bank was built over 10,000 years. So around 1900, whatever, in the Northwest here, the first cut of the old-growth trees, and they would cut, and then they would burn. 2 withdrawals from the carbon bank. And they'll go to 1950, 50 years later approximately, we have a second cut. And what they do, they'd cut the trees, and they'd haul them away, and they'd burn again, all the brush. So 3-4 withdrawals from the carbon bank. We go to the year 2000, and we have another cut, a third cut. Same thing happens, 5-6 withdrawals from the carbon bank, and 100 years. That took the 10,000 years for that soil base to be built. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that we have a much higher withdrawal from the carbon bank than that which we are contributing to it. So that's an example of monoculture, and as a result, the soils have thinned, and now you're getting what's called premature decline. Now, premature decline is when trees are toppling over because the root wads can't be strong enough to hold the trees. So the logging industry and the economists that are working for them look at the trees and go, we have to cut them before they get blown down or get diseased. And so you have diseases now proliferating in these 3rd, 4th generation cut forests. Soils are thinning, the yields are declining, and so the logging companies are selling this off as real estate because they know they're not getting the yield of return of board feet of timber. Now that, I think, is the wrong economic metric. We should be looking at ecological metrics because the contribution of a forest cleans water. These cloud forests capture so much moisture, and as a result, the watersheds are protected. Seattle, Washington has a fantastic watershed because the city bought the old growth forest from the logging companies before it was logged, and so as a result, we have a fantastic reservoir system of fresh water. Well, had that forest been cut in the way that I just described, that watershed would not be there. We wouldn't have enough water for Seattle. But this segues, I think, nicely into something. I have dedicated my life to helping the old growth forest, and I know it well. Some of my best friends were loggers. Some of the best environmentalists I know were loggers, little contrary to what people think, but they wanted to protect their steelhead streams for their kids and their grandkids, They were very upset when the ecosystem was destroyed around the nature that they enjoyed recreationally after work. But I became involved. We have a very eclectic culture collection. We have about 500 strains of fungi in culture. We have very large laboratories here. We live in a place called Kimilchi Point, Washington, south of Seattle, at the base of the Olympic Peninsula, very close to the old growth forest. So my wife and I have a great team here, and we are dedicated hikers. We go into the old growth forest, and we try to get into culture rare strains of mushrooms before the ecosystem is destroyed by logging, for instance. They are still logging old growth forests. When I was logging, the logs were going to Japan to make toothpicks, if you can believe that. They were making
heard that story.
Toothpicks out of old growth forests, So our culture collection became of interest to the U.S. The U.S. Defense Department directly after 9/11, because we have a large cultural library, and I wrote 2 articles in a peer-reviewed journal, Novel Antivirals for Mushrooms and Novel Antimicrobials for Mushrooms. It was a literature review, basically, of all the scientific research that's been published to date on novel activities of mushrooms against viruses and bacteria. A whopping 3 to 4 pages each. That's how little information was known. And I thought, well, this has not been explored very well. Then after 9/11, the biggest concern the U.S. government had by far was weaponizable viruses. They could track radioactive metals, and because of their emissions, and that was much more controllable. But viruses don't care about borders. They can be, one person can transmit to hundreds of other people. And the exponential pandemic that can be created from that is something that is horrific. So the BioShield Biodefense Program, which is a triangular relationship between NIH, DOD, and U.S. AMRID, U.S. Army Research Institute of Infectious Diseases, they contacted me and they said, you're welcome to submit samples to the BioShield Biodefense Program to see if you have any activity against viruses, and particularly pox viruses. Smallpox was a big concern. The Russians had smallpox. The U.S. government and some other countries do. I went to Russia. I went into one of the laboratories that had smallpox. It was literally in an old, 1950s refrigerator that had one of the locks on you used to have in high school, that could kick it off. The
Sure.
windows were broken. There were pigeons flying into the building, literally. This is in 1994. I was horrified, and then, I was given information that smallpox was sold to Al-Qaeda. Hopefully the pox viruses were dead in the test tubes because their storage was so pitiful. But we submitted over 500 samples of our mycelium growing in the laboratory into the BioShield Biodefense Program. Sent off these samples, didn't hear for a while, and then it was actually kind of a funny story because then the Federal Express delivered me a package, very thick package with a few hundred research reports from the samples that we sent. And I'm flipping through these samples, and no activity, no activity, no activity. I get to sample 76, and well, lo and behold, active, then highly active against orthopoxes, including smallpox. And I got real excited, and I thought, this is fantastic. And I was given a contact in the U.S. military, a colonel, and I called him up saying, these results are fantastic. I'm so excited. And he said, what results? I said, the results I just got delivered via Federal Express. And he goes, "You're not supposed to get those results." I am. I said, "I'll photocopy them and send them to you." There's a little bit of humor there. He didn't take it that way, but the BioShield Defense Program was pretty disorganized, because, of course it would be with 3 government agencies trying to coordinate on something new. But then when I gave them coded samples, I didn't tell them what species of mushrooms I had sent them in the mycelial form. And I also did the mushrooms themselves, hot water extracts and ethanol extracts. And I did the same for the mycelium, from which the mushrooms sprang. And then, very interestingly, a mushroom that came out on top, highly active, is one called agarikon. Agarikon is a mushroom that grows exclusively in the old-growth forest. It does not grow in second growth. It doesn't grow in third growth. So when these clear cuts are made of the forest, destroying biodiversity, this species becomes extinct. And so this agarikon mushroom, it looks like a bee's nest or a wasp's nest. It's very, very big. It's the longest living mushroom in the world. It can live for up to 100 years in the old-growth forest, subjected to hundreds of inches of rain, wind, sleet, hail, and yet it doesn't rot. And so I was attracted to it because it was so rare. And my dear professor, who was my mentor, he found his first agarikon after 40 years of searching in the old-growth forest, found his first one last year. Our team now, we have collected 45 strains of agarikon from Northern California, Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia, by far the largest culture collection in the world. And so we had extremely high activity against orthopoxes, and then we started to engage in what's called bioguided fractionation. And this is basically a stepwise sequence of using different solvents to isolate out the active fractions. Use water and use DMSO or hexane or different solvents, and you see which pathway of fractionation still had the activity. And working with the University of Mississippi with the Natural Products Program over about 5 or 6 years, we isolated out a new molecule unknown to science that's highly active against pox viruses. So that was really triumphant. We have not published this, but we have a new magic molecule that we isolated from this rare old-growth species. And so we have a press announcement that was vetted by DOD. If anyone wants to Google my name, Stamets and smallpox, they can see a vetted DOD press release. And then National Public Radio interviewed myself, the deputy director of the FDA and the founder of the BioShield program, on NPR.
Right.
And we had the highest activity of any sample, more than 200,000 that were submitted, including mostly pure pharmaceuticals. But we submitted a natural product. And then in the course of these discussions, we found out that we were the highest activity of more than 2 million samples. And because my intuition seemed to be right on, I submitted replicates. And what I mean by that is in samples 72 and 76, 78 were really the same sample. But I thought that this agarikon mushroom, because of its host defensive resistance against pathogens, the longest living mushroom in the world, would likely have this activity, and I was right on. And by submitting replicates, I was able to authenticate the research results from the laboratory because the results came back as the same. And so the BioShield Biodefense Program were very happy that I had done this because it authenticated that their research test results were good. Well, we those of us born after 1968, basically you are what is known as being immunologically naive, which means you have no immune defense against smallpox. People have not been vaccinated for many, many years. So this is a big concern. If smallpox does get out again, we hope that it does not. But by far the virus of concern now, viruses of concern are flu viruses, especially H5N1. And so
you were saying that is actually carried by flies.
Yeah, what many people do not know is that H5N1 bird flu can be transmitted by house flies. So if there was a bird flu pandemic, don't use a fly swatter against your window. And so flies go around diseased chickens, which are immunocompromised, and bird flu is carried by chickens. And another example of monoculture in factory farms. These become breeding grounds, and so they have those samples. So when bird flu became such a big concern, we then asked the laboratories to transfer the samples to a different laboratory to test against bird flu. And this is when we hit the big home run. And that agarikon mushroom in the old growth forest is extremely active against bird flu. We have entered into a period of viral storms. And I met with some people in Washington, D.C. I'm not going to mention the agency that I met with, but I was talking about weaponizable viruses, and they said something that put shivers up and down my spine. They said, Paul, it's no longer a concern of bioterrorism using bird flu. There are so many epicenters of opportunity of bird flu emerging out of nature now that they predict in the next 10 years that a bird flu pandemic is going to occur. And so I was, we were delighted that we had this activity against bird flu that was so powerful. Now, for any scientists out there listening, smallpox is a DNA virus, and bird flu is an RNA virus. It is unusual to have one concoction that'll be dually active against both. Typically, those will be toxins. When we did the bioguided fractionation at the University of Mississippi, and we found this magic molecule active against pox viruses, when we sent it to St. Jude Hospital to test it against bird flu, guess what? No activity. That's good news. Because we found that within this mushroom is resident a consortium of antiviral compounds that we haven't fully elucidated yet. But we know that there's a different group of molecules that are active against bird flu. So this is a very good argument, which I've been able to make, that we should save the old growth forest as a matter of national defense. If we lose the biodiversity of agarikon in the old growth forest, and we have 45 to 50 strains of agarikon on culture now, some of these are more active against bird flu than others. And so just like you find different molds of like penicillium strains that produce more penicillin than others, this is, the biodiversity of these fungal species is critically important. So, I've been following bird flu epicenters around the world, and on the eastern shore of Japan, and there was 3 different wild bird flu events on the eastern shore of Japan before the earthquake, and then the earthquake occurred, and now we have a perfect storm. We have a tidal wave and an earthquake, and we have Fukushima, and then it's a perfect storm of dead people, dead pigs, dead birds, and a saline solution and salt water, all commingling. And those that have survived are immunocompromised. Nature's a numbers game, and when you're immunocompromised, you're more susceptible for carrying and harboring these viruses, and you can harbor more than one. And so if we have the communicability of H1N1, which we had a few years ago, combined with the lethality of H5N1, which is over 70% fatal, then we are facing a pandemic of historic proportions. And so we became very concerned, and I still am very, very concerned about a bird flu pandemic, which I think is on the near event horizon. It's coming. And
you're talking within a year or two or longer?
I think we'll have it within 10 years. But it's coming because there's too many opportunities now.
So the odds basically compel it.
It's compounding odds as time progresses, as habitats are decimated because of chemical pollution, overpopulation in factory farms, and this monoculture approach to our food our food base.
Gotcha. We got to take another break. I'm telling you, this is going by quickly, Paul. Paul Stamets, our first-time guest tonight. fungi.com. Please check it out, and we'll be back as we make our way through the darkness and hopefully to the light. This is Coast to Coast AM. Well, I'll tell you what, it sounds a little bit grim, doesn't it? Remember what Tyler Durden said in one of my favorite little movies, Fight Club? On a long enough timeline, the survival rate goes to 0. However, I have a feeling that Mother Earth is going to find a way to survive with or without us, and it all apparently began, at least as we know it, with a mushroom. I want to get in some remediation here. I want to find out if there's any light at the end of the tunnel with this pending pandemic. We all know that it's a distinct possibility. In fact, it's darned likely that this will occur. In fact, I just saw a report about some contaminated chickens out of Mexico, and they're definitely contaminated with avian flu. So let's find out. Hey, there's always a flip side of the coin. And there's no point in fear-mongering. Just as a side note here, have you noticed how discombobulated, baffled, and otherwise like bumbling and blundering those that we have put in the position to take care of us seem to be lately? I have a feeling I know why that is. I think it's becoming so undeniably, ridiculously obvious that the populace is waking up. I mentioned during some of the programs at the end of 2012 that we were waiting for an awakening, waiting for something to change, something to happen. And I submitted to you that you are the awakening. And I believe that you are the awakening because the longer you listen, not only the later it gets, but the more you know. And the more you know, the better equipped you are to deal with the future because it's coming, whether we like it or not. We'll be back with Paul Stamets, the Mushroom Man. Got a lot of questions for him, and if we have time, we'll take some calls, but we'll let you know when. We'll play the numbers at that time, and we'll be right back. A little 2-minute break, please. This is Coast to Coast AM, Saturday night edition. Paul Stamets, when we started our chat tonight, I just listened for long periods, and I was thinking, oh, my God, this man is a genius. It's certainly not only probably academically, but also, is there such a word as experientially? And I'm wondering... Doesn't this sort of research take an enormous amount of funding, or did you just do it? Did you just get in there and do it yourself?
Well, largely I've done it myself with the help of some very good people. We created a business. I was accepted into 3 graduate schools. I do have a doctorate of science now, but I was accepted into 3 graduate schools, but I married a woman who was 11 years older than me, and she had 3 teenage kids. So I was a young father, 24 years of age, and I couldn't afford to go to graduate school and move the whole family. So I started a little mail order business, and my whole intention to starting the mail order business was to create funding to do research. So it's an artifact and sort of an after consequence that the business was created as a funding vehicle, which we funded a lot of research in the course of this. But I do have some sort of good news on the horizon. But since we mentioned Fukushima, I think this is a perfect example, I think, of a teaching moment, something that we didn't intend or expect. My father was a nuclear engineer with Babcock and Wilcox, and he was involved in the storage of nuclear waste. And he's now passed, but I protested against nuclear energy, and my dad was a pro-nuclear guy, so we had lots of debates. But he did say one thing that's hauntingly true. He said, no matter what, son, you cannot store the nuclear waste adjacent to an operating nuclear power plant. If you have a runaway reaction, then those fuel rods will become basically fuel for a runaway reaction. And
well, isn't the waste more radioactive than the spent rods? Are more dangerous than the unspent rods?
Depending on how they're stored. He was involved in vitrification of glass, encasing them in glass, which he thought was the best solution. But, we in no nuclear safety manual, did they have an earthquake creating a tsunami that would cause a meltdown. That was not something that they anticipated. Indeed, that has occurred. I'm involved with a group of people who have been to Fukushima, and I have very intimate knowledge of what is happening in Japan. And, it's an island country. They can't go anywhere. The government doesn't want to create hysteria. but it's far worse than the public has been told. The Japanese have been very faithful and trusting of their government, and now they're very skeptical, and they're losing that trust. But there are hot spots across Japan. There's millions of gallons of salt water being used to cool the reactor currently. They can't throw the water away. They have to store it. They're scooping up hundreds of tons of soil per day and putting them in the cement bunkers. By doing so, they denude the breadbasket of Japan, and so they're impairing the ecosystem in terms of growing food. And so there's very little recourse, for cleaning up the environment. And as more earthquakes occur, there's actually a xenon glow of they had cameras on the fuel rods which had melted, and so they had full disclosure to the public, and here's what they look like. But then scientists realized that there was a xenon, a greenish blue glow of light, and they were saying, "What's that?" And of course that was not a good thing, because it shows this reaction is continuing and getting worse. And so they then put white light, floodlights in order to diminish the visibility of the xenon glow. But this is an interesting area of research, and I'm involved in it right now in terms of micro-remediation. And one of the teaching moments in history is from Chernobyl. And after Chernobyl, in downwind environment, Ukrainian scientists went and began to analyze in the forest is the foods that people were collecting to consume, and to see how the radioactive fallout was concentrating. And lo and behold, they found that mushrooms were hyperaccumulating radioactivity. And there's a mushroom called Gomphidius glutinosus, the hideous Gomphidius. It's a mycorrhizal mushroom, grows in association with the roots of trees, and it hyperaccumulates cesium-137 more than 10,000 times the background levels. Now, this is extraordinary because the radioactive fallout falls like rain, or with rain, and the mycelium then upchannels this radioactive metal, which substitutes in the metabolism of the fungi for potassium. On the atomic chart, they're very, very close. And so the cesium is upchanneled via the mycelium over large expanses of the forest, and then hyperaccumulates them into these mushrooms that burst from the mycelial mat, and the mushrooms come up for a few days, and the mushrooms become highly radioactive, more than 10,000 times the radioactivity, but in doing so, decontaminates a large swath of land. Now, why would these mushrooms do this? Well, we don't really know, but a good thing that they do it. And I think it's one way of nature is being able to mend from a disaster, is that the skill sets from the biodiversity of these fungi within the ecosystem gives us an opportunity, or gives the ecosystem an opportunity to let other life forms which are not tolerant of this radioactivity to be able to proliferate. So we fast forward, and then a group of scientists at Einstein University was watching videos of Chernobyl inside the damage containment area, and saw something that was fascinating to them. They saw black molds growing on the cement walls. Now, in that environment, there's more than 1 million rads of radioactivity. This is an extraordinary amount of radioactivity. No life forms were thought to be able to live in this environment, but these molds were growing all over the concrete. There's no other nutrients there. So they thought that was very interesting. They got samples of these molds, and then something extraordinary, heretofore unknown to science, was discovered by the scientists at Einstein University, that the melanizing fungi that have the same pigment that we have in our skin exposed to sunlight, the melanizing fungi are able to use gamma irradiation for cellular metabolism in a fashion similar to the way that plants can use sunlight for photosynthesis.
Unbelievable.
This is incredible. And because I'm involved with this TED community, I have a TED Talk and a TED Med Talk that are very popular. Larry and Sergey invited me to Googleplex, the co-founders of Google, and there's a bunch of brainiacs go there, a bunch of Nobel laureates. About 120 people were there, and I got to meet the leader of the Martian project, going to Mars. And I'm talking to them. I go, "What's your biggest concerns?" And he goes, "Oh, by far, food. We can get 6 months to get to the planet with astronauts, a year on the planet, 6 months to get back. We can't haul the food. It's just too much mass. They're going to have to grow it." And I said, well, how are you going to grow it? And he goes, well, we're going to grow it. Well, we think we're going to grow it in greenhouses. I go, greenhouses in the vacuum of space? How are you going to heat these, et cetera, et cetera? He goes, yeah, it's a huge conundrum. We don't know what to do. Well, this discovery from Chernobyl, and an unfortunate teaching moment, we now have the possibility of using gamma radiation from the spacecraft's engines or from gamma radiation elsewhere to grow fungal foods. So this discovery may allow us to explore other planets. This could be the tipping point for the interplanetary colonization of space. And so I got real excited about this because I'm involved with fungi on multiple levels, and I thought, well, this would be perfect. We could actually grow fungal foods and then use the fungi to terraform other planets. And so as you get to Mars, then you have these fungal filaments you can put onto the rocks. And Mars is very high in carbon dioxide, and these fungi are very tolerant to high CO2. And they could begin to munch the rocks to create the soil lenses for then terraforming Mars or other planets, or creating the greenhouses on Mars where you're creating the soil. So as terrible as these disasters are, humans are really good at seeing a silver lining and an opportunity for being able to take the examples of nature. And we need to listen to nature and amplify those lessons and those successes. And when we divorce ourselves from nature, we get away from nature, then we're closeted and we're opaque to the opportunities that nature is suggesting. I believe nature is constantly calling out, telling us that, wake up, humans. We have lessons to be learned here. Please be sensitive to them. See what nature is offering. And I think this is a clear example of that. So we are now.
So is humankind going to be part of the remediation? I mean, you seem to have a very positive outlook on the future, but I'm wondering if I'm just wondering if the railroad or the mining car is going so fast down the track that we can't catch up.
Well, the rule of nature is that any organism exceeds the carrying capacity of its ecosystem, there'll be cataclysmic events, usually diseases that emanate out of the ecosystem that knocks down the offending population, the species that is out of control. I think that our population on this planet is growing too fast. We're at 9 billion. 8 billion. It's the population explosion is stressing all ecosystems beyond their limits. That's why it's a terrible thing to say. I love people. I love children. But a viral pandemic will knock back the population maybe in a reset to levels that we can then be able to have more sustainability.
Going back to I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I hope that's not true. I hope that isn't true. But I think de facto it will occur, whether we will like to believe that it will or not. I think nature bats last, and if
she's just going to take care of it.
Yeah.
So when you were talking about avian flu earlier, make me smart on something here. Make everybody smart on this. Is this a specific virus, or is it a virus that can remain itself and yet, if not mutate, then adapt as we try to eradicate it? It seems like if it's a specific virus, there must be some specific countermeasure to it, but it appears that that's not the case.
Well, the antiviral drugs, the viruses quickly develop tolerances against them. So because of the diversity of viral strains, even in H5N1, there's many different forms of H5N1 are being discovered now, and some of them are a lot more drug resistant than others. There's H3N2. That's the one that was circulating around just recently. That's the other one that Agarikon is extremely active against, H5N1, H1N1, H3N2. If you go to the magic bullet single drug approach, that's really different than having the nutraceutical approach, which gives you a platform of multiple antiviral agents in a consortium. It makes it a lot more difficult, I think. That's the reason that triple antibiotic ointments work better than single antibiotic ointments.
Sure.
It's very, very hard for the bacteria in this case to be able to negotiate a defense against 3 different antibacterial pathways. But so with the Fukushima, the idea, and I wrote a paper right after Fukushima, the nuclear force recovery zone, and I proposed it, and it's up on the web, and it got translated into Japanese, went all over Japan, is to retire a 30-mile zone around Fukushima as a nuclear forest, an old-growth forest, which would mend itself over several generations, or maybe many generations, and using these mushrooms to hyperaccumulate the radioactivity, you could selectively go in and then harvest the mushrooms, then remove them, and then incinerate them. No one's going to complain about burning mushrooms. And then you recapture the radioactive metals through scrubbers. And this way you can decontaminate the environment without removing the soil. And this way the ecosystem can heal itself. This is very Japanese-esque, as it turned out to be. The Japanese love this idea. And we're actually involved now in researchers, and we're working with a group. We've begun dialogue with a group at Hanford, at the Hanford nuclear reservation here in Washington State, to actually prove this. And we have a number of species as candidate species to see if we can use these mushrooms, which have melanin, these melanizing fungi, and then you would harvest the mushrooms, and then over time you would decontaminate the environment in a stepwise fashion. Now, this has been met with this has been taken very seriously by top-notch scientists. I was afraid of mycophobia. They'd make fun of this, and exactly the opposite has occurred. They think this is a very interesting, viable alternative because there are no other alternatives. The other alternative is to denude and scrape up all the soil, and you're down to barren rock, and now the ecosystem is devastated.
This thing that was just posted, the 16th at 10:25 in the morning Eastern Time, they all know, in quotes, over 5 million becquerels per square meter of soil, I suppose, the cesium-137 in Fukushima City. They're talking about problems 180 kilometers away.
Yeah, and they don't want to create widespread panic. Where are the Japanese people going to go?
Is the country, just between ourselves and the rest of the world, they're in bad trouble over there.
And they're demoralized, and their immune systems are compromised because they're demoralized as well. So this speaks to a larger picture of health. When you are under assault, from exposure to radioactivity, you're under stress. Your immune system is also further impaired. Again, nature's a numbers game, and your health is a consequence of many factors and cofactors which interplay with each other. And so we have to look at the complexity of these situations to gain some benefit. So these viruses have really caught my interest, and because we have such interesting results now against H5N1, flu, pox viruses, and now and also hepatitis. I've been very much interested in oncoviruses. Now, about 14% to 18% of cancers are directly attributable to viruses called oncoviruses.
I'll tell you what, that's an extremely important point, but you have large thoughts. May I call you Dr. Stamets?
It's an honorary doctorate, but Paul is fine.
It doesn't matter. As far as I'm concerned, you're a doctor. I think in some ways an honorary doctorate, I think that's even more profound, frankly. Let's talk about these onco complications, and then let's get into diet. Let's see if we can remediate ourselves. Chemtrails, nuclear waste, petroleum waste. Oh, stand by. More to come. This is Coast. We have a lot of ground to cover. I have no idea that we can cover much of the 30 years of experience that Paul Stamets has gained in his study of mushrooms and everything that goes with them, the mycelium running, how mushrooms can help save the world. I think he's right. I'm just wondering how many people are on board with him. We have a bunch of questions to ask, so let's get our little break over with quickly so we can get right back to Paul Stamets right after this. This is Coast to Coast AM. Paul Stamets, we were just about to get into onco ramifications and maybe countermeasures.
Yeah, onco means cancer. So
Mm-hmm.
oncoviruses are viruses that are implicated in inducing cancer. About 14 to I think 17% of cancers are virally induced. HPV causing cervical cancer, HIV, immunocompromised individuals, then we all have cancer all the time. So your immune system is constantly fortified in trying to combat these abnormal cells as they go awry, and then Hep C causing liver cancer. So finding from these mushrooms that they dually have antiviral effects and also they promote the immune system is very much of great interest to some of the top researchers in the world in immunotherapy. And NIH funded our team with a $2.2 million breast cancer clinical study that has just been completed. It was about a 5-6 year study for stage 3, stage 4 breast cancer patients, non-ER, non-estrogen responsive breast cancer. That they opened it up to ER positive patients as well. And the study using turkey tail mushrooms shows a direct dose response curve, which means that the more turkey tail mycelial capsules that you take, the more the immune system is enhanced, as measured by natural killer cells and CD8 cytotoxic T cells. These are your frontline immune cells that attack cancer. Is activated in your gut. So when you consume this, then your immune system is alerted. There are several different pathways in the immune response. One's called toll-like receptors. I don't need to go into that. Another one activates a gene sequence that creates what's called P53 tumor regression proteins. And so these are another example of epigenesis. You consume something, your body responds genetically and produces these tumor regression proteins. And so the studies, I was a co-investigator on the study initially. I helped write the grant. And then when the grant was approved, we were all very excited. This is at the University of Minnesota Medical School and Bastyr Medical College. And they asked me, since I was the mushroom expert on our group, what mushrooms should we use? And I said, well, you should use ours. I know the process well. And they go, well, there's a conflict of interest. You can't be a co-investigator and a supplier. So you make the choice. So I said, okay, well, I'll resign as a co-investigator. And I became a supplier. But then they said, well, how did they know that yours are the best? And so we were put into a pool of 5 other companies that provided turkey tail products, and thankfully we came out on top. We came out as based on the immune markers, and because we're certified organic, we have a chain of custody. That's really important. All mushrooms that consume should be certified organic, and the chain of custody means that we're transparent. So it's coming from us. We have complete control from the very inception of the culture all the way to the end of the production cycle. So the clinical study, was progressing, and then this became deeply personal to me in June of 2009, when my mother, who has not seen a doctor since 1968, at the time she was 84 years of age, and she calls me up and says, Paul, I have something really important to talk to you about, but you're always so busy. I went, oh no. What is it? And my mom, who was a very cheerful person, started crying on the phone, and I knew this was extremely serious because I've never heard her cry before. And she said, I'm scared. I'm worried. And I said, what's wrong? And she goes, my right breast is 5 times the size of my left. I have 6 angry lymph nodes that are swollen the size of walnuts on my right side. And and she goes, I'm scared. And I'm not ashamed to say I started crying. I go, why didn't you tell me? And she is in a very deeply charismatic Christian environment, and they prayed for her. And then somebody with a dark field microscope came by and said, you don't have cancer, and my mother realized that obviously she did. So she reached out to me, and as soon as I heard this, then I said, we have to get to Seattle. And we went to the Seattle breast cancer clinic. And upon our second visit, we were given the worst news possible. She had the worst case of breast cancer this oncologist had seen in 20 years. She should have been treated 2 years earlier. It It had metastasized. It crossed the meridian, which means it crossed into the sternum, into her liver. She had big lesions in her liver, and then everyone in the situation, I asked how long, how much, and realized her tumor was on the verge of bursting through her breast. It was that bad. It was growing very, very rapidly, and the doctor had said optimistically you have 3 months. And so my mother was, we had the circle meeting, the family, and we planned, for what was going to happen with the family and her funeral. And she went out and she announced she bought a pine casket, the cheapest one she could find, because she's going to Jesus and she doesn't need to spend good money on a casket. That just made everyone just tear up even more. And so we went back to the oncologist, and they said, you're too old for radiation therapy. And radiation therapy, by the way, diminishes your immune system.
Oh, I'm
and that's
sure.
what the phase 1 clinical study was based on, that, and showed that after radiation therapy, your immune system is depressed, and with the turkey tail mushrooms on a stepwise basis, your immune system came back much faster than without them. And she said that you're too old for a mastectomy because at 84 your immune system's not very good and you could get an infection. So they said there's very little we can do for you, and they did give her Taxol and Herceptin. She had an adverse reaction to Taxol, and Herceptin is a wonderful drug. And then the oncologist said, but there's an interesting study on turkey tail mushrooms at the Bastyr Medical College. You might want to take those. And my mother then, she goes, well, my son's supplying those. So she had to hear it from a doctor. And so my mom started taking 8 turkey tail capsules per day, continued on Herceptin, and we all planned for the worst, and, when people are fighting cancer, there are so many other things happen, their personality changes it's called chemo brain also, and she started taking 8 turkey tail capsules per day along with Herceptin, and that was in June in 2009. And today she has no detectable tumors whatsoever.
Is that right?
And her case has been written up in an oncology journal as it's called a best case outcome, and international health initiatives, and it's Googleable. I guess that's the word, Googleable.
Googleable, yes.
And so she's been written up, gone through peer review. They interviewed her doctor. They interviewed me. They interviewed her. And my mother, at the time, when she went over to Wenatchee, Washington, in the eastern part of Washington State, to be treated over there by her oncologist because she couldn't drive the 6 hours for treatment. And my mom asked me, she said, well, should I tell my oncologist I'm taking turkey tail? And I said, Mom, don't. Because most doctors are not up the learning curve. They haven't read the literature. And out of an abundance of caution, and this is due to medical ethics, they'll tell you to stop taking anything else so we can see if our therapy works. And it's very interesting because subsequent to this, I'm interviewing the doctor, interviewing my mother, and interviewing myself. The doctor said, I'm so glad that Patty, my mother, did not tell the doctor, that she was taking turkey tail mushrooms, because the doctor, she said, in the interview that was published, that she would have told her to stop taking the turkey tail mushrooms. My mother and I believe that would be a life and death decision. And we believe that she is alive, and we believe personally that she is alive today because of the combination of Herceptin and turkey tail. Now, compliant with FDA regulations, we can say emphatically that these turkey tail mushrooms have been proven to support the immune system. Whether clinically this will increase the lifespan of cancer patients is not yet known, even though there's lots of other studies out there that are strongly suggestive of that. The jury is still out on a large, multi-center clinical study and redundant studies to prove this. But from our point of view, in our family, I don't give medical advice, but I reserve the right to give medical advice to my mother. And she is alive today. She has no detectable tumors. She is just, she's happy. Her personality's come back. And the oncologist, in the peer-reviewed article that was published on the best case outcome of her study, they found something that I totally missed. she had no loss of appetite. She had no nausea, and she had no chembrain, which they thought was remarkable because typically as a symptom of these chemotherapeutic drugs, you end up having this malaise, there's a personality shift, there's loss of appetite, which also impairs your immune system because you're not having good nutrition. So I think, and now NIH, and with FDA approval, has approved a new phase 2, phase 3 clinical trial with turkey tail mushrooms for both breast cancer and prostate cancer. So we think we're on the road to showing that these mushrooms enhance chemotherapy. And we have some very good models now that we understand. We think that these mushrooms decloak the cancer. It's called immune evasion. The cancer evades detection of by the immune system. So the immune system cannot discover and find receptor sites, docking points on the stroma of the tumors. And with these mushrooms, it appears, hypothetically, that the mode of action is that this is discovered actually by a group of oncologists who first proposed this to me from Fred Hutch Cancer Center in Seattle, is that putatively the mushrooms decloak the cancer for immune discovery. So your immune system can find the cancer, basically lock and load, and then invade through the stroma of the tumors and scavenge it away. If this indeed proves to be true, then the enhance of the immune system, with these mushrooms and age, our immune systems decline. This could be just a game changer, and helping chemotherapeutic drugs work better, helping baseline immunity, and your immune system fights more than just cancer. It can fight, viruses and all sorts of other forms of insults that we're all suffering from.
Well, would this be something that you could take as a dietary supplement to ward it off, or is this only these turkey tail mushrooms? Are they only to be taken after you have the problem, or is it a preventative?
Well, I would defer to other oncologists, but I personally take them every day.
Gotcha.
I think we all have cancer all the time. I'm 57 years of age. From the literature that I've read, from the experiences that I've had, I know what I will do personally, and I think. But there's another mushroom I really want to tell you about that I'm totally excited about. And I'm writing a series of articles for the Huffington Post on mushrooms. I have 8 of them out. They all go through peer review, pass a panel of MDs, and so they're very nicely vetted. They're short articles because the Huffington Post requires that. But there's another mushroom which I think is the first smart mushroom. It's the first mushroom that I think increases intelligence. And
I could use a bunch of those.
Pardon?
I could use a bunch of those.
I think we all could use a bunch of those. And it's so sad as elders with this lifetimes of experience and knowledge to undergo neurological dementia is just such a tragedy, because there's so much knowledge and information to be passed on to the next generation. And we have the baby boomers who are aging, and Alzheimer's and other forms of neuropathy, but Alzheimer's in particular is becoming the greatest age-related cause of death of any diseases now out there. It's surging. And this is a huge problem. But this mushroom is called lion's mane. And Dr. Kawagishi gets credit for this. He actually published a patent on it and published the first articles in 1994, 1996, I believe. And what lion's mane has is they're called thiophane derivatives. These are 2 novel molecules that cause regeneration of myelin on the nerves. Myelin helps transmit the signals, and the myelin remyelination effects of these mushrooms have been described as the best nerve growth stimulant factors of anything ever discovered. Now, more recently, that's been a long time ago, it's in 1996, but thankfully in the past 2 years, there's been some very, very interesting studies. And now the first studies I'll mention are with mice, and then it went on to, actually clinically to postmenopausal women who suffer from anxiety. But the mice experiments are just elegant. And what in Alzheimer's is an amyloid plaque that forms. And upon death and dissection, an autopsy, they can say, "Oh, your loved one died of Alzheimer's." Otherwise, symptomatically, they present all sorts of neuropathy, but you don't really know if they died from Alzheimer's, until posthumously.
Sure.
So the amyloid plaque, shows up under the microscope. Well, they had these mice. And they injected a polypeptide that induces the amyloid plaque, and so it mimics Alzheimer's. And they put the mice into a maze. It's called a Y test. And the mice very quickly, when they're normal and healthy, they can figure out which direction to go to find the food reward. And they learn this, very, very quickly. Well, after the peptide is given to them that causes the amyloid plaque, then they begin to show the symptoms of Alzheimer's, and they forget. They are no longer able to navigate through the maze to find the food. Okay, so they could then after the mice are sacrificed, they look at them under the microscope, and the amyloid plaque is there. They can see it. So the direct cause and effect relationship, very, very clearly demonstrated. But the more interesting experiment, I think, was the other one they did. And it's one of novelty. And the normal mice put it into an arena. When they put a new object in the cage, then the mice get real excited and they explore it. And they actually can calculate how many minutes each mice explores the new object. And then it becomes familiar after a while, and they don't explore it as much. When they put another new object in there, they get real excited and they explore it, like toys or something. But when they induce the amyloid plaque reaction to mimic Alzheimer's, they lose the sense of curiosity, of novelty. But here is the amazing discovery they found. They took these mice after they developed Alzheimer's-like symptoms, and they fed 5% of their diet with a lion's mane mushroom for 23 days. And after 23 days, the Alzheimer's mice regained novelty and curiosity back to baseline of the normal mice. And then upon sacrificing the mice and looking at it in the microscope, the amyloid plaque had resolved. It was no longer there.
Let me ask you this plaque that we hear about in arteries and hearts, and the plaque that we hear in dental issues, and the plaque that we hear in the brains of Alzheimer's patients, is it the same? We're down to 1 minute. Give me a quick one here.
No.
Is this the same plaque?
In a general sense, yes, but in a specific sense, no.
Excellent,
the amyloid plaque is directly interfering with the transmission of neurons.
Gotcha.
So it's
all right, we're going to have to pause, Paul. I hate to do it, but we just have to. We'll be back with Paul Stamets, and I want to ask him about psilocybin mushrooms when we come back. What discussion about mushrooms would be complete without it? This is Coast to Coast AM. Well, thank you very much. Nice shout out to the LA Command crew. That would be Nathan and Gina. Thank you very much for keeping the ship straight. Can't just fly this thing by myself, I'll tell you what, 3 hours does not do justice to Paul Stamets' work. It's absolutely unbelievable. But let's quickly take our last little, what we call the floating break, as we float on into Sunday morning here. And I want to talk about very briefly about psilocybin mushrooms. They're all over the world, it seems. I guess everybody likes them or something. And also his website is extraordinary. You will enjoy it. Fungi. Fungi.com, Fungi Perfecti. And look at some of his books. One of them is Growing Gourmet and Medicinal Mushrooms. This thing is like over 500 pages before you get to the appendixes and the glossary and so forth. It's amazing. It's a real study. So go to the site and take a peek, and stick around for our last segment with Dr. Paul Stamets on Coast to Coast AM. Paul Stamets, in just these 5 volumes, this is an extraordinary body of work, and as I indicated, 3 hours with you is simply not enough. But let's touch briefly on this psilocybin thing. I don't know if it's legal. I've never had any myself. what you call square, I guess, in some circles. But they seem to be important to a lot of people because the title of the book is Psilocybin Mushrooms of the World. And I'm just curious, what was the... I wonder if you have the historical attraction to these mushrooms, and what purpose have they served?
Well, they've been used for thousands of years, and they are currently illegal in the United States and have been so for a while. My work was fully covered by a Drug Enforcement Administration license under Dr. Michael Bugh, and so for over 10 years, I studied, researched, grew lots of these, and the 4 species of mushrooms that you mentioned that I've published and named, they're all psilocybin active mushroom species. I will never be an apologist for my interest in study and use of these mushrooms. They've been absolutely essential and critical to my view of the world, and I think they've helped my creativity enormously. By coincidence, in today's Lancet, which is, extremely revered and respected medical journal, on volume 381 on page 526, there is an article on the use of psilocybin mushrooms for psychotherapy for treating patients with life-threatening depression and for obsessive-compulsive disorder. Johns Hopkins, Dr. Roland Griffith, has conducted now 4 clinical studies therapeutically with the use of these mushrooms for treating people who are facing end-of-life issues and depression with remarkably positive results. And in the UK, 2 years ago, there was a study, and I'm going to read something directly from the Lancet. These UK studies are revealing how psilocybin seems to reduce activity in key connector hubs of the brain, those that might have a role in the constructs of ego and self-identity to allow a state of unrestrained cognition and enhanced memory recall. And it quiets the brain is in constant communication with its other nodes. And this results now medically, we think, this feeling of oneness with the universe, expansiveness. The floodgates of the senses are opened up, and you get enormous amounts of stimuli coming in through the visual cortex. But the brain is able to receive this information in a quieted state and enhance mental acuity. And so these mushrooms have been used shamanistically, over thousands of years, and laws come and go. Marijuana is now legal in Washington State. Who knew?
Right.
And, I would agree that for 90% or more of the people using these mushrooms, they are not probably giving them benefit. I abhor the use of them in a party atmosphere, et cetera. But under good medical supervision, there's very, very good evidence now, and Dr. Roland Griffiths, Griffith, his work at Johns Hopkins Medical School points to that these mushrooms in a therapeutic setting are safe, and they can resolve some very intense issues, also related to alcoholism and post-traumatic stress syndrome. And the therapeutic sessions have revealed in one 4 to 6 hour session, the therapeutic benefits in that one session eclipses their therapy over multiple years of conventional therapy that's been given. Several of the conclusions of the studies that he's done are very interesting in that a few people did have negative experiences. But those people had negative experiences. The negative experience did not extend beyond the experience itself, 4 to 6 hours. The vast majority had positive experiences, but retroactively 2 years after the experience, when they interviewed the patient, their relatives, their friends, they all, the patient had benefit 2 years later that was demonstrable, that was noticeable. They're better citizens, they're better parents, better brothers and sisters, and very and this feeling of compassion and resolving the issues of facing near death. these are all demonstrable benefits from the use of these mushrooms medically. So I think psilocybin mushrooms are medicines for the soul. These other mushrooms I've been speaking about help the immune system, but also because when you are depressed, your immune system's depressed. And if you can resolve your depression, perhaps these mushrooms also can be therapeutically used as an adjunct to enhance immunity. Don't know. But the research is very, very interesting. And I refer people to the Lancet article that just got published today, and also to the studies that are mentioned therein, as well as Johns Hopkins.
Interesting, very interesting. So in other words, when you say the negative experience doesn't extend beyond the period that effectively that the drug has its effect, so you don't get flashbacks like you would you hear about with LSD use, for example.
I don't believe in flashbacks. I wish I would have one. They promised me the flying car too, and I didn't get that.
I use that analogy quite a bit.
Yeah. So I mean, this whole thing with flashbacks, I think is part of the hysteria. Maybe there's some cases out there, but the scientists that I've talked to, they don't know about this, or they haven't seen it. But yes, these mushrooms, I think, offer a foundation of benefits multifactorially, and this is something that science now, and I have to say that it's nice that the scientific community has come full circle, because a lot of scientists were afraid to be made fun of. Their interest in mushrooms would invoke skepticism and bad jokes, and people's eyes glaze over, and they feel nervous about the subject they don't understand, and so they tend to make fun of it and they move on. Well, now we are looking at these mushrooms as being miniature pharmaceutical factories producing a whole slew of compounds. And John, you asked earlier about how do we know which mushrooms are edible or poisonous. Well, it's the same reason we know how plants are edible or poisonous, or animals are edible or poisonous. There are poisonous frogs, obviously.
Sure.
And we know from the experiences of our ancestors. And so of the 150,000 species of mushrooms out there, the 14,000 that we've identified from our ancestral use, we've narrowed it down to about 100 to 200 species, which we know are safe, which do offer benefits. And now we're delving into the pharmacology of these mushrooms. We're finding that they're rich in all sorts of their novel compounds, which can help us survive into the next century.
What would you, can you make a suggestion as to, I think if anybody is interested in mushrooms at all, they must have at least, well, they got to have all five of these. They got to have mycelium running. They've got to have growing gourmet and medicinal mushrooms, and they have to have the mushroom cultivator. But is this something that requires an awful lot of attention, or can people get into it and make their own medicinal mushrooms, or is that just too much of a stretch?
Well, mycelium running is the book that I think has really crossed the threshold. It's a lot of very influential people have read it and are recommending it, and that's a really good book for people to start in. If you want to get into growing mushrooms commercially, gourmet or medicinal, then Growing Gourmet and Medicinal Mushrooms is used as a central textbook around the world. It is 595 pages long. Sorry about that, but there's a lot of stuff to cover. But
Yes.
It gives you very precise, detailed, step-by-step instructions on how to grow the mushrooms in a wide variety of substrates. Mushrooms give you more protein per square acre by far of any food source in the world, far more than that of cattle and chicken, based on the use of the substrates, the ecosystems per square acre in terms of the yield of food coming out of that square acre. So they're fantastic at recycling wood waste and straw, and they're very good tandem for a lot of farms and that are producing a lot of roughage and other material. So Growing Gourmet and Medicinal Mushrooms is the one I recommend for growing mushrooms. And mycelium running covers many of the subjects that we've been discussing tonight, which is a game changer, I think, in being able to tilt the course of human evolution to a more positive future by engaging our fungal friends and our fungal allies. They have a vested interest in our survival, and we should have a vested interest in theirs.
In your opinion, if a person could not cultivate their own mushrooms and they were to seek them out at an outlet somewhere, perhaps your website, which ones would be which of course would be the best option since you're the authority on mushrooms? It makes sense to go to fungi.com, fungi.com.
Well,
what would you recommend they take regularly?
Well, I mean, for growing in a kit, you mean, or for?
Well, just as a dietary supplement. You said you take the turkey tails every day.
Yeah, I also take a 17-species blend, 17 species in one blend. That's called My Community. This blend, there's a lot of species in there, and they have a lot of benefits. And I believe in synergistically of those benefits, and your body sorts out that which it needs. That's what it does with food, by the way. These are really functional foods, and these are not medicines per se. These are precursors for helping the immune system, and they're very supportive of the immune system. So I personally take My Community in turkey tail, and I take My Community in lion's mane. I do believe this lion's mane is a smart mushroom. And there's a lot of research, the Huffington Post articles that I've written on lion's mane, on many of these other mushrooms are well referenced with peer-reviewed studies, and I think that the whole medical establishment is increasingly waking up to this. If you go to PubMed and put in mushrooms, there's hundreds of articles that have been published in the past 4 years, peer-reviewed, excellent articles on the different pharmacological agents and nutritional benefits, et cetera, that are resonant within these mushrooms. So I recommend that people eat mushrooms at least 3 to 5 times a week, just nutritionally, and you should mix it up. You should have shiitake, maitake, oyster mushrooms. They're delicious, and if you want to go out collecting mushrooms, of course there are poisonous ones out there. So you should only eat mushrooms that have been positively identified by an expert. You're pretty safe to go to the stores and eat them. Always cook mushrooms. Don't eat them raw. But if you want to join a mushroom society, they're fantastic. You know, they go out on forays. You're with experts. And I've had many, many elders in their 80s and 90s have told me that they got into mushrooms when they were toddlers, when they went out there with their family collecting mushrooms in the woods, and they were quiet with their family. They had the attention of their parents. They were away from the business, the phones. It was like an Easter egg hunt, and those were some of the most cherished memories. And many mushroom lovers are multi-generational now. They hand down their secret mushroom patches through their family. And it's a wonderful group to be involved with. The national organization is called the North American Mycological Association. Their website is nonprofit NAMYCO, NAMYCO.org. They list all the regional mushroom clubs, mushroom societies in the United States, Canada, and Mexico. So you can then join these clubs. They have monthly meetings typically, and they have forays. And they're an eclectic group of really interesting people.
And what's the site again?
Pardon?
What's the site again that you can connect with them?
Is the North American Mycological Association. Is
gotcha.
N as in Nancy, A, M as in Mary, YCO.org. Mm-hmm. And they're a fantastic group. I'm a lifetime member, and I joined when I was like 18 years of age. There's a lot to this subject that is titillating to the senses. And it gets you outside. It's good to exercise. It exercises your brain. And you meet the most interesting people from all sides of the political spectrum. You know, that's the cool thing about it, is that you end up meeting people you wouldn't otherwise socialize with, but you're unified in this passion and interest, and you have this eureka experience. It's literally an endorphin rush because you get hooked on this, because when you find a new species or you find a mushroom like a morel, and you know, it just jumps out at you, and you have this eureka experience, which is just wonderful.
You know, we're down to about 4 minutes, and I just wanted to go back. There was something in where is it? Which book? Well, you'll know where it is about the oil cleanup, the diesel cleanup, where it had been effectively neutralized.
I work with Battelle Laboratories, and basically in the decomposition of oil using oyster mushroom mycelium. It's called mycoremediation, and we decontaminated oil laden soil from 20,000 parts per million to less than 200 with oyster mushroom mycelium. We happily just received a grant from the Environmental Protection Agency, from the EPA, for mycofiltration of bacteria. And we use oyster mushroom mycelium as a sheet mulch because water does not discriminate. It carries hydrocarbons, oil, it can carry bacteria, it can carry silt and nitrates, all of which adversely affect downstream environments. So we've designed these mycelial membranes that can be put into choke points where there's a convergence of these toxins, and then we can remediate and prevent downstream environments from being adversely affected. So this is, I believe that there should be organic mushroom farms in every community, and they should be reinvented as environmental healing arts centers. And every time there's a catastrophe, nature is subsidizing the cost of the substrate to produce the mushrooms, and the mycelium then can repair the catastrophe that's been inflicted on the environment in a very rapid fashion. And this is something that I think that people should pay attention to. A lot of people are. But there is a mycological revolution that is occurring now around the world, and there's a lot of other people who are very much hip to this idea now, and the proof is in the pudding. These are demonstrable, repeatable, and very strong results that can really empower communities, fight hunger, fight disease, and clean up pollution. And we are, as I mentioned, we are involved in 6X. And the rule of evolution is those organisms that pair with fungi tend to survive. I think it's time that we pair with fungi post haste.
That's absolutely amazing. Do you find that we're really running out? And just hit me real quick with this one. Is there some biological discrimination, as my earlier submission set forth, or are more scientists and people in the medical community sort of getting with this mushroom program?
No, there's a wave of interest. The skeptics are good. It's really good to have skeptics. And I like to convert my skeptics into supporters because you have no greater supporter than a skeptic that has been converted.
That's right.
But there's a sea change right now that is occurring. And any skeptic that is out there, just go to PubMed, go to these clinical studies, do the research, become informed. An informed opinion is a respectable opinion. If people have the knee-jerk reaction saying this is poppycock, this is nonsense, well, those are uninformed decisions, and that's the result of this mycophobia, this illogical fear of fungi. And so, like anything else, if you're going to have a pilot on an airplane, I'd rather have a pilot who's experienced, who's knowledgeable, than somebody who's just a passenger making cheap shots. So,
good to have you with us tonight, Paul. We got to bail. We're down to like less than 30 seconds, but would you please come back again soon?
All right. Thank you, John. I appreciate it.
Oh, it goes both ways. Well, do not do, as Dr. Timothy Leary said, do not turn on, tune in, and then drop out. You need to turn on, tune in, and beam up. Talk to you Friday. Mothership out.